Welcome to Book Banter with me, your host, Dianne Burkhart. I hope you will join me every Wednesday as we explore all things to do with, well, books. Let's get on with our show today. Hello, my happy people. Today is May 15th, 2024, and I would like to welcome all of you to Book Banter with Dianne Burkhart. That would be me, your hostess. And I just want to say today is such a great interview. It's always so hard editing shows like this whenever you just really hit a stride with somebody and you have such a great long conversation, but then all of it can't go into the podcast. It's so difficult to choose what to cut out and what to keep. It's really a struggle. But I think what was left for today is really fascinating. Of course, honestly, the whole thing was fascinating. I wish you could hear all of it. But my podcast streaming plan does not allow for me to have hour-and-a-half podcasts all the time. So you're going to be getting the distilled version of this conversation. But it's so fascinating getting to speak with another person who writes historical fiction at about the same era in American history that I wrote my books, because it can be a real struggle at times because there are so many things that happened during that time period that, of course, we as evolved Americans have come to realize is not acceptable. You always have to balance what you want to include in your book so that you are historically accurate, but also keep in mind that sensitivities nowadays are not what they were at that time. And you want to be true to history because it seems disingenuous to not do that. But at the same time, you want to be sensitive to people's understandings of the way the world is now. And we actually get into that discussion. So this is a potential trigger warning for you. In case you do not like those kinds of conversations, this may not be the episode for you. Now, I don't want to waste any more time on my own blather here. So let's get right to today's interview. Please welcome to Book Banter with Dianne Burkhart, Robert Hilliard. Now, the way that I always start these interviews is I just ask my guests to please tell our audience who you are and what you do.
Okay. My name is Robert Hilliard. I am an independent author. Just recently published my first novel called In Freedom's Shadow. It's actually my second book. My first book was an outdoors book that came out about 12 years ago. It was titled A Season on the Allegheny, and it was about the Allegheny National Forest in northwestern Pennsylvania. I'm a native of Western Pennsylvania. I lived out of the area for many years, but I guess about 2 decades ago now, I moved back and I've lived here ever since. I'm a husband and a father of 3 kids, and I'm starting to turn my focus now more toward my writing career.
Well, now, you've had a long writing career. You've just recently turned to novels.
Yeah, I guess that's a better way of saying it. I have had a very long writing career, actually. I guess let me back up. I am one of those people who, from the time they were little kids, were writing detective stories, as we called them. Mm-hmm. And all through school was always writing papers and writing stories and things. And then my degree, my training was in marine biology. And when I got out of college, moved to Florida and worked there for about 4 years in the marine science field. And my first paid publication was in Florida Oceanographic magazine. So, and that was, 33 years ago, something like that. So yeah, I guess it's been a while. And then I went on to write for newspapers. I did some freelance magazine work for a couple decades, kind of moved into outdoor writing and did that pretty regularly. I had a column in a monthly magazine and then did some other freelance work. So probably did that for about 10 years. And that all led up to then the publication of A Season on the Allegheny. When I finished that, there was a period of time there where I thought, well, maybe that was it. I did a book. I always wanted to do a book. And then, I got the itch again, I guess. So started getting interested in working on a novel. And that's how In Freedom's Shadow came to be.
And how did the sports writing play into all of that?
Well, I grew up playing sports. And so then when I moved into working for the newspaper, I played football in college. So I had some background there. And I lived in an area where they didn't have a sports reporter. So they were like, hey, can you go, cover some high school football games for us? And I'm like, well, okay, yeah, I know the rules of football. I've played it. So I started doing that. And then that kind of grew into, I did some features. My interest always goes back to history. So I did some features on various aspects of the history of different sports. So as it turned out, this was not at all by design, but I did an article for the Pittsburgh Tribune Review on the history of baseball, which actually tied into the Civil War, which of course relates to the subject matter of Freedom Shadow, but about the history of the sport, the origin of the sport. And that article ended up going into the library in Cooperstown, Baseball Hall of Fame. And then a few years later, I did an article also for the Trib on the history of the merger of the AAFL, which is a football league most people don't remember anymore, but it was actually the first merger between the NFL and another league. A gentleman named Carl Rebele, who kind of oversaw the rewriting of the rule book for that merger. And so that article ended up in the Pro Football Hall of Fame library. It's not like it's hanging on the wall or anything. I think you dig for it. And then I did a magazine article for Pittsburgh History Magazine on one of the very early basketball teams that played in Pittsburgh back around the turn of the 19th century, or 19th into the 20th century. And that article ended up as part of a submission for one of the players to the Basketball Hall of Fame in Springfield, Massachusetts, in an attempt to have him considered for being entered into the Hall of Fame. So, yeah, sort of by coincidence, certainly not by design, but I had 3 different articles written at years apart that ended up in 3 different pro sports halls of fame.
That is amazing. Oh my God.
Well, it was, like I said, it wasn't by design, and I'm not sure that the quality of the writing as much as the subject matter, which I was just fortunate in finding those things. I think that was probably more the deciding factor there in the interest from the halls of fame. So
I think that also gives a little indication of your quality of writing, though.
Well, I hope so, I guess. But yeah, I was in some of those. I was fortunate. In the article that about the NFL merger, I was really fortunate because, as I mentioned, I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, so I'm an avid Pittsburgh sports fan, and I actually got to interview that was the owner at the time of the Steelers, Dan Rooney. So that was like luckily I had a tape recorder when I interviewed him because I was so starstruck that I probably didn't even write anything down in my notebook. I probably just scribbled gibberish the whole time.
Yeah, I get that.
But that was actually an awesome experience.
So how did you go from being marine biologist to journalist and then moving on to books? Was this a plan that you always had like in the back of your head that someday you wanted to write books, or did it just kind of happen?
Yes and no. Sorry for stammering there, but like I said, I am like an avid reader. As I'm sitting here, I'm staring at hundreds of books on our bookcases. I'm one of those people who can't sit for 5 minutes without picking up something and reading it, even if it's the back of a cereal box or whatever. And I'm a very fast reader too, fortunately, so I blow through books. So yeah, I guess, like I said, I grew up reading. I guess in my mind, I always thought maybe I would write a book someday. When I was doing outdoor writing before I published a season on the Allegheny, I mentioned I had a regular column in a magazine, and it was about public lands in basically the tri-state area, eastern Ohio, western Pennsylvania, northern West Virginia. So I would sit down and sort of scope out and say, okay, well, I'm going to go to this location and write about this, and then I'm going to go to this location over here and write about this. And I would plan out my agenda several months in advance because you had to worry about weather and all those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was sitting down one night and I said, I haven't written anything about the Allegheny National Forest, which is a huge tract of public land, about 500,000 acres. It was one of those things where I think I was actually laying in bed and talking to my wife, and I'm like, well, it's so big and there's so many different parts to it. I could go here and write about this, and I could go here and write about this. And I said, there's enough there that I could write a whole book about it. And it was that aha moment where I'm like, oh, you know what? I actually could write a book about that. So then I think I hopped out of bed, ran downstairs and grabbed a pencil and paper, started writing down all those things that I had just been thinking. I'm going to write about this, I'm going to write about that. And that became kind of the backbone of A Season on the Allegheny. And then I published that. It was very well received. Frankly, got more attention than what I was expecting, considering that it was a pretty localized, very specific subject.
That one actually hit top 10 in 2 Amazon categories, didn't it?
It did, yeah, and that was in 2012. So, in fairness, there were less books and less categories in those days. But yeah, in fact, it surprised me. 2012, I published it, and right away it started selling. And when I say right away, like within 2 days, I had people reaching out to me and saying, "Hey, are you going to do a paperback version of this?" Mm-hmm. And I was like, at that point, I just wanted to publish it. I just wanted it out in the world. I didn't want the year and a half that I'd spent working on it a complete waste of time.
Yeah.
But anyway, in the summer of 2012, we put out the paperback version. As you noted, it went up the charts pretty quickly, sold really well, and even now, 12 years later, I get a nice little royalty check every month, a deposit in the bank. It's hard for me to believe that what I thought would be just a little project, kind of throwing it out there, has had that much legs. So yeah, that turned out to be a very nice surprise.
Well, and it is showing that it's well received in the ratings, because you have 4.5 out of 5 on Amazon. I mean, you've got really good reviews on it.
I appreciate that. And it got very good editorial reviews. Midwest Book Review, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette actually named it it was in their Christmas gift guide for outdoors people.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so some little things like that. So yeah, it was pretty well received. The basis of the book is about hunting, which can be kind of a polarizing topic with some people. Mm-hmm. And so I think there are a couple reviews. I don't know if there's any like 1-star reviews in there, but there are a couple that were not as flattering, let's put it that way. And I think some of that focus was because it was about hunting. I'm not sure how somebody picked it up and didn't realize it was about hunting at first. But anyway, so I think not to make excuses, but I think it actually might have had a slightly higher rating if it had been a little bit less of a polarizing subject. So,
yeah.
I don't know. I'm somebody probably like you who I buy a lot of books, but mm-hmm. will read about them first.
Yeah.
You read the cover blurb, you maybe read a review or two so you know what you're getting into. And that might just be because I'm a cheapskate and I don't want something I'm not going to like. But yeah, I will always check it out usually before pulling the trigger.
Yeah. See, for me, I don't have a lot of free time. I'm reading so many books by author guests on the podcast. I've got my own books that I'm writing. I'm doing the magazine. I don't have time to spend on books I don't want to read. So exactly. I always read the blurb, read reviews, read about the author to see if it's somebody that I really want to support what they're doing. And then I buy them.
Yeah. And you know what? That's an interesting point. I have as I refer to it, my paying job. Mm-hmm. In addition to being an author. And in fact, not to skip ahead here, but one of the reasons that researching and writing Freedom Shadow took me about 7 years from the time I started on it, found out who John Scobell was and started on the book to the point that it got published. Part of the reason for that is when I first started on it, I was working at a job where I was working about 70 hours a week, and I just couldn't make progress. Like I would get a little bit done. And then what's it been now? About 18 months ago, I guess, I changed jobs, and it's only a 60-hour-a-week job now. And that was just enough to allow me the extra time to get the book written and published. So, but to your point, it's the commitment of time. And I just read an interesting article about this, about independent publishing here recently. Somebody had asked a question, well, my book only costs 99 cents or it's free. I don't remember which it was. And it's still not selling. And I don't understand why everybody doesn't, if it's free, why doesn't everybody just download it? Mm-hmm. And the answer was, it's the commitment of time. It's not the money, which is your point, right? Regardless of the price of the book, I was joking about being a cheapskate, but if something's $1.99 or free, the reason people don't download it is because they have to stop and think, do I want to commit the time to reading that 200 or 250 page book? Even if it's free, is it mm-hmm. going to be something that's going to interest me and hold my interest all the way through to the finish line. And if they don't think it is, but based on whatever, the cover or the blurb or the reviews, then they're still not going to pull the trigger on it because it's the commitment of time that matters.
Oh, yeah. And one thing too, I want to talk about, you have got a fantastic cover for In Freedom's Shadow. It grabs your attention. It's perfect for the topic that you're discussing in the book. And it's just absolutely gorgeous. I know it is so hard to find good cover designs, especially when you're independent, because they can be so expensive. Where did you get yours?
First of all, thank you. Although I can take absolutely zero credit for the cover. The only thing I did for the cover was pay for it. But I went through, probably a lot of independent authors, I listen to a ton of podcasts and read a ton of articles about independent publishing. So I found Reedsy, and I heard and read about Reedsy, and I went on there, and it's, for anybody who doesn't know about it, it's kind of an online marketplace for independent authors who are looking to self-publish, and they have editing services and a bunch of other stuff. But one of the things is cover artists. And again, I am a cheapskate, so I originally tried to do something myself with Canva. It was predictably garbage. So then I went to a website that I can't recall the name of it now, but it's through Drafted Digital. They're a partner with Drafted Digital, or I think Digital actually owns them now. But it's like pre-made cover art.
Yeah.
And you pick the one that you like and you download it. And they're relatively inexpensive, less than $100 per cover, I would say. I looked through hundreds of them and just couldn't find one that I liked that really fit the theme of the book. So finally I'm like, okay, so I'm going to have to spend a little bit more money here. So went through Reedsy, found a terrific cover artist. His name's Jerry Todd. And you put in a description of the book, what it's about. I think it's either 4 or 5 artists that you can give them a proposal for the book. And then they come back to you with their cost proposal to do it. We decided to work with Jerry. And he said, I don't remember exactly, but he said, I'll have some drafts to you in 3 weeks, let's say. And about a week later, he came back and he's like, you know what? I know I said it was going to be longer, but I started working on these and I got really excited about it. And I just want to know what you think. And he sent us, 3 or 4 versions of the cover, different color combinations and a couple different photo combinations and stuff. I remember my wife and I were out shopping at the time, so I'm opening up on my phone. And my eyes must have been like one of those cartoon characters where they just pop out of your head. And, you could hear the ooga horn in the background because the covers were so fantastic.
Yeah.
And as soon as I saw him, I'm like, oh, okay. I'm not even worried about the money that we spent on this because this guy is just hitting home runs from the first moment. And people have commented on the cover, and I'm happy to take those compliments, but I had absolutely nothing to do with it. So I will say I took a stab at doing one myself. And so there was a timing issue, which was entirely my fault because I waited too long to make a decision. But when we were putting the book In Freedom's Shadow up for pre-order, the cover wasn't done yet. And it wasn't going to be done until closer to the time when it was going out for publication. But I wanted to do a couple months of pre-order. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, well, I'll just put up the cover that I did myself as a placeholder, and because they won't let you do a pre-order without a cover image. And then I'll just swap it for the real cover later. And that's what we did. And that was all fine, except on Goodreads, which still has the garbage cover that I did. And I can't figure out how to get it to change. I'm trying to do that. So if anybody wants to see an example of the really bad cover artwork that I would produce on my own, you can go to Goodreads and see the original placeholder cover. I encourage you not to do that, please. If you have some sort of morbid fascination with poor cover art, you can certainly do that.
Yeah, I'm going to be looking that up later. Now, your book In Freedom's Shadow came out just November of 2023, and it's already got a 4.7 rating on Amazon. It's doing very well. Why don't you tell us about your book?
Well, yeah, thank you, first of all. In Freedom's Shadow is based on a true story of a man named John Scobell, who prior to the Civil War was a slave in Mississippi. Then after the outbreak of the war, He escaped from slavery, made it away from the Confederate lines and into the Union lines, and then ultimately made it to Washington, D.C. And at that time, this was really in the first year of the war, fall of 1861. The person who was the head of the Union Intelligence Service at that time was Alan Pinkerton, which is a name probably most of your listeners will recognize from the Pinkerton Detective Agency. At the outbreak of the war, there was no national intelligence service, didn't exist. So as soon as the war broke out, both sides realized that they needed an intelligence service to be able to spy and find out what the other side was doing. So just as they would today, when they didn't have somebody to fill that role, they brought in a government contractor. And in this case, that government contractor was Pinkerton, and he had some contacts with, well, specifically with George McClellan, who had been named the head of the Army of the Potomac, the Union Army. So McClellan brought Pinkerton in, and they basically just picked up the detective agency from Chicago and brought them to Washington, D.C., more or less lock, stock, and barrel. All of a sudden, they had government security contractors, again, just like we might today, and they became the Union spy service almost overnight. Pinkerton was an excellent detective, really groundbreaking. He was kind of a middling spy master, and he was a terrible author, which I will get to in a bit. But he didn't really understand some of the distinctions between being a detective and being a spy. And there are some important ones, like the timeliness of gathering information. You don't have all day to do it. During a war, you need to gather information quickly and utilize that information quickly. And he didn't always understand those distinctions. He also tended to exaggerate some of the information that he was passing up the chain in terms of troop sizes and things. But anyway, one of the smart things that he did was he realized very early on that as these battles were being fought, there were escaped slaves coming across the lines from the Confederate side to the Union side, and they would be a great source of intelligence, of information on the Confederate, lines of battle and what kind of armaments they had and those kinds of things, because they were literally just there yesterday or, just a few days before. And those escaped slaves coming across were very much incentivized to help the Federal Army defeat the Confederate Army. So they were a terrific source of information. And in fact, there were two quotes that I included at the front end of In Freedom's Shadow. One was from Frederick Douglass, basically saying in much better prose what I just said. Then there's another quote from Robert E. Lee, essentially saying the same thing in different words, that I'm paraphrasing again, but that there's no better source of information to the Federal Army than the slaves that had escaped and gone to the North. So Pinkerton was interviewing these slaves that escaped. John Scobell was one of the ones who came through. Scobell distinguished himself because he could read and write, and also just because he had what we might describe today as street smarts. He knew how to handle himself. So he made such an impression on Pinkerton that Pinkerton actually recruited him to become an operative. And Scobell was sent back to the South at least two different times that we know of on covert spying missions. So he went once down to the eastern shore of Maryland and then across into northern Virginia and back up. And then a second time, he actually went to Richmond, to the capital of the Confederacy, and was spying with another female Pinkerton operative. And he was there undercover as her slave, and she was posing as a widow of a plantation owner. So they were actually spying, under the nose of the Confederate government in Richmond.
Can you imagine going to the capital of the Confederacy and spying? Considering what would have happened to him if he had been caught, that takes some incredible bravery.
It really does. And I've thought about this a lot. In fact, my wife and I we were driving home from a book signing the other night, and we were talking about this subject again. You've spent your entire life wanting to get away from slavery, and then you finally achieve that. And then you turn right back around and you accept a mission to not only go back where you were and be treated as a slave again, but to risk that if they find out what you're really doing, quick death would be the best outcome, because it more likely is going to be a long, slow, painful death. And the amount of courage that took is staggering. And in some ways, I feel like I maybe did Scobell a little bit of a disservice, because when I first wrote the book, I had him being sort of this altruistic character who was like, yeah, I'm gonna go back to the South. I want to help my people. I want to help the Union win the war, like all the good stuff. And then as I was reading what I wrote, I'm like, that's just not that interesting. It's not, like, if he's just the good guy who's just doing good things because he is a good guy, that's less interesting than if he really does want his freedom. So he, the way I wrote it, had to be coerced a bit to go back to the South. And I did that, like I said, because I thought it made for a more interesting story. But I may have done him a disservice, because in real life, he might have been that guy who just said, you know what, I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. So I hope that's not the case. We'll never know. But like I said, I thought it made for a more interesting story rather than just that sort of knight in shining armor character who's just doing it because it's the right thing to do.
Well, considering that this is definitely solid historical fiction, how much research did you actually have to do for this? I mean, how much actual historical fact did you incorporate into this novel?
Well, you asked two different questions there. How much research did I have to do? How much did I actually do? Because I did way more than I probably really needed to do. And actually, in fact, I'll kind of share a funny story with you. The way that I landed on this story itself was because I was researching something else and I stumbled onto it. I originally had in mind an idea about spies during the Revolutionary War, but I was researching it and I accidentally stumbled onto an article on the CIA website, which is, of course, where everybody does their research. But it was about spying during the Civil War. And I'm like, well, that wasn't really what I was looking for, but, might as well read the article, right? And the typical Google rabbit hole. Mm-hmm. And I started reading it, and there were some names in there that I recognized, like Harriet Tubman and some other folks. And then there was this guy, John Scobell, and I'm like, that's not a name I've heard before. And so I read about it and really, got inspired to tell that story. That started me on the path. I way, way, way over research every article, each of the books that I've done. The hard part, of course, is paring that back.
Yeah.
So when readers get to the end of the book, there's an afterword in there that kind of tells some of the answer to your question. Basically, I focused on which characters within the story were real and which ones were not. In the afterword, just give some explanation. So I made a couple of rules for myself. One was to stick to, as much as I could, what was known, not only about Scobell, but what was going on at that time. So, he wasn't going to jump in a Ferrari and run across town. But also, as I was doing that research, if I found a person, any person who ended up being a character in the novel, that they would only be in the place that they were known to be at that time. So if I was writing about something that was taking place, let's say in January of 1862, and this certain person I knew was in Washington, D.C. in January of 1862, I wasn't going to have them be in Richmond at that time. So that was the rule. And there was one, and I'll just leave this as a teaser, but there was one exception that one conceit that I allowed myself there, one character that I know for a fact was somewhere else, but that's one that I'll leave for readers to find out for themselves when they finish the book.
Considering that this is historical fiction during the Civil War, there were a lot of things that happened at that time period that are definitely not well received nowadays. And with you being a white man writing about a Black historical figure, did you use a sensitivity reader before publishing?
I attempted to. I intended to, let's put it that way. So when I finished the book, it went out to a batch of beta readers to help with editing. And I specifically selected a couple of my friends who are Black and got the book into their hands to give me that feedback, looking at the language for exactly the reason that you said. But I do feel strongly that people are people. And so when I was doing the research that we were talking about, and some of it was frankly hard to read. A book like 12 Years a Slave, for example, was one went to as a resource. It's almost physically painful reading what they went through at that time. And I worked some of that in. I tried to make it so it's not like beating people over the head, because that wasn't the main part of the plot. But at the same time, I want it to be realistic. But anyway, my point is that I did get it to my friends for that feedback. Unfortunately, as it turned out, life got in the way for them. And so I got a little bit of feedback from one of them. And the other couple just ended up being too busy with their paying jobs and their lives. And so they weren't able to give me the feedback. But I got it out to some other folks, including my kids, who I think are more, just by virtue of their age, they're in their 20s. They have a different look at things. And some of the other people that were beta readers too, I selected because I knew they would have a little different look at things. Got their feedback, incorporated their feedback. But there were some things that I decided not to change. So specifically, the biggest concern was the use of the N-word. And at the time period of the Civil War, that would have been common usage, certainly in the South. But there's a sensitivity around that for modern readers. So one of the recommendations that I got from one of my beta readers was to just take it out entirely. And I thought hard about that. And it was something that my wife and I talked about extensively too. And at the end of the day, I tried to minimize the number of times and places where it was used, but I felt like it would be disingenuous to remove it completely. A, because it would be factually wrong, but B, because the people who were using it are the bad guys in the story, to put it in a very simple, straightforward way. And that would have been, again, realistic to their character. And I don't mean character in a book there. I mean their personal character of the people at that time. When somebody is behaving that way or using that language, someone else reading today can look at that and say, oh, yep, that person's a bad guy. So that was some of my thinking in the process. And then I was talking to another interviewer here recently. He made a really good point that I hadn't really thought about, but we were talking on the same subject about, removing the N-word from the story. And he said, that lets those people off the hook. If you had done that, it kind of whitewashes the racist character of the people in the Confederacy at the time. And I hadn't thought about that, like I said, but when he said that, I was like, you know what, that is also a good point. So it all kind of goes together. I did minimize it. I replaced it with some synonyms of the time, which are really equally racist. But in today's world, they don't have the baggage attached to them that the N-word has. Mm-hmm. And so when people read them and see some of those terms, that doesn't trigger them the way that the N-word does. To me, it's ironic because I'm looking at that. I'm like, that's just as bad. But it doesn't generate the visceral reaction that the N-word does. Well, hopefully I was able to successfully find a way to navigate that.
Well, and beyond all of that, one of the things that really struck me is this story and this historical figure is so important to American history. And I know I did not learn anything about John Scobell in grade school or junior high or high school taking American history class. I never heard about this individual in history until your book. I had no idea about his story or his contribution to American history. It was never taught to me.
There have been, he sort of at times rises up to the surface. There was an article about him in Ebony magazine in December 1963. And then these cards that became popular, mid to late 70s and even into the early 80s that were just about American history. And they were produced by a company called Pan Horizon. So I actually bought on eBay a John Scobell Pan Horizon card. And on the front, it has a picture, and on the back, kind of his story. But you're right. He's never made it into sort of the popular lexicon, if you will, Civil War. One of the reasons for that is because there's really only one primary source of information about him, and that is Alan Pinkerton's book called The Spy of the Rebellion that was published about 20 years after the Civil War. And as I started researching Scobell, who he was and what he did, I kept pulling on all those threads, and every time I kept coming back to Pinkerton's book. Everybody was ultimately referring back to that. Mm-hmm. So I reached out to a guy who's a historian, but actually worked for the CIA. And he had written the article that appeared on the CIA website later after it was declassified. Not sure why Civil War spying needed to be classified at that point, but whatever. But I got in touch with him and I said, hey, I can't find any other primary source of the Spy of the Rebellion. And he said, yeah, that's it. So
Wow.
everything since then has built from there. And there are some people, and just to be, full disclosure, there are some historians who don't believe that Scobell ever existed. They think that maybe Pinkerton fabricated him, which is a little hard to understand because, he wrote about a lot of other things in that book, mostly himself. But it wouldn't seem like there would have been a big incentive to work that in there if it wasn't the truth.
Yeah.
Some other historians have suggested maybe Scobell was an amalgam of several different escaped slaves that Pinkerton worked with, which may be true. But really, the bulk of serious historians agree that Scobell was a real person and he did do these things. But that might be one reason that, we haven't heard that much about him because there is just sort of this one source. I'll share with you a story. Early in the process of working on the book, my son and I were driving home. I was beating his ear with story ideas and just kind of kicking around like, well, I think I might want to have him do this. And I think I might want to have him do this. And he said, well, what are the true parts? So I was telling him, and he just interrupted me at one point and said, Dad, you have to write this story. And I said, yeah, I'm like, that's what we're talking about, right? I'm intending. He's like, no. He goes, you have to write Scobell's story. He said, this guy was a hero, and what he did helped change the course of the war, and everybody's forgotten about it. And he said, after 150 years, people don't know who he is. He said, you need to write his story, and you need to give him his voice again.
Mm-hmm.
And that stuck with me, really, as a writer, and I'm sure other people listening who've tried writing a book can appreciate this, but you get to slow spots, right? You get to a point where you're like, I don't know if this is really any good. Do I want to keep going? You start questioning.
Yeah.
And every time I hit one of those potholes, I went back to what Jake, my son, had said. And I thought, you know what? I got to keep going because if nothing else, I need to tell Scobell's story and get it out there again in a way that people can at least recognize who he is and what he did.
Mm-hmm.
And, as Jake said, to give him his voice back. So that's what really kept me going through the hard spots. And hopefully, to your point, people who don't know who John Scobell was or what he did can now, even though it's in a fictionalized version, can read that and have an appreciation. And not only him, but lots of other people who in similar situations.
So now this is the point of the show that we like to do 5 quick questions that never turn out to be quick, but I'm just too stubborn to stop doing it. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Since you were so involved in sports, what is your favorite sport to watch?
Oh, hands down football. It's not close. Like I said, I grew up playing football. I played in high school and college. Attempted to play after that, but as it turned out, the NFL had other ideas. But yeah, I'll watch. A few years ago, during the first iteration of the XFL, one of my friends that I worked with at the time texted me, and he's like, I know you're watching an XFL game right now. It was like a Saturday afternoon. And I texted him back and I said, you're right. And he texted me back and said, you're the only person in America doing that.
So question 2, what book have you read the most?
I think I'm correct in saying that all the books I've read are tied in first place because I don't think I've ever reread a book.
Really?
Yeah, I might be wrong in saying that, but I'm fairly confident, which is kind of funny in a way because I'll watch a favorite movie hundreds of times.
Yeah.
Can't tell you how many times I've seen Animal House or The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly or Tombstone or, Aliens, whatever, all my favorites. But for whatever reason, if I pick up a book, maybe I read a book, 20 or 25 years ago, and I forgot that I read it, but I'll pick it up and I'll be a chapter or 2 into it. And I'm like, I already read this book. And for me, I don't know why. It's just annoying to reread something and remember it as you're going along. So that said, I've kind of said to myself here recently, and it's probably just because I'm getting older and my memory's fading. So there's probably some books that I read that I don't remember anymore. But I've thought about starting to reread maybe like some Agatha Christie, which I used to love, but I got to the end of all her books and then I was done. And just some other like Louis L'Amour books I read. I can't say I read all of his because he wrote hundreds, but I read a good batch of them, and I have been thinking about going back and rereading them. But yeah, I don't believe that I've ever reread a book.
That's really interesting because there are probably about like 5 books that I have read and reread so many times. And I mean, there's one of them I could probably just sit here and recite the whole book and I'll still sit down and reread it.
Well, and like I said, I'm that way with movies. In fact, I will definitely annoy people by saying every line in a movie like
Yeah.
3 seconds before the next character does, or at least the lines that I think are funny. And I'm sure I'm missing out by doing that.
So, question 3, what is your preferred genre? Whenever you go to a bookstore to buy a new book, where do you go first?
Good question, because I am all over the board and I will read anything. And I've read everything from romance novels to science fiction to horror to obviously spy novels. I read a ton of nonfiction, and usually I have at least 2 books going at any moment. So that said, where do I go first? So can I get 2 answers? Can I get a nonfiction and a fiction answer to the question?
Sure.
Okay. If I can get special dispensation to do that. In the nonfiction, it's almost always history or biography, but like people are still alive are not interesting enough to me. You have to be dead and preferably dead for several decades or maybe centuries before I get interested in you. So I do read a ton of biographies. I'm looking at the shelf here. I have John Adams, Grant, about a half dozen Washington biographies, Benjamin Franklin, Lincoln. So, and then some sports biographies too. That is usually one of my first stops. On the fiction side, I probably favor more mysteries than thrillers, which probably seems kind of strange for somebody who wrote a spy thriller. But yeah, I really like a really good whodunit. But at the same time, I'll read westerns all day. I will read spy thrillers. So I'm pretty agnostic when it comes to the specific subject matter. But the main thing is it going to grab me and hold me?
Question 4, what is your best practice for whenever you get stuck on a writing assignment, whether it be articles or books or whatever?
I'm not sure if this is a best practice, but it's probably the best advice. And I read this, it was by Stephen Pressfield, who wrote, among other things, Legend of Bagger Vance. And I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially his advice was get your butt in the seat and type. And along with that, in the same piece, he said, you never hear about trucker's block or contractor's block. And the reason you don't is because those people show up and they go to work every day.
Mm-hmm.
So writers don't have to have writer's block. They just need to get their butt in the chair and start typing.
Question 5, what is your favorite moment that you had with a fan at a book signing?
Man, let me think about that for a second. There were probably 2. Again, I can't ever just give a straight single answer, so I'm gonna ask for forgiveness and give you 2 answers instead of 1. The very first book signing that I had for A Season on the Allegheny was in the Allegheny National Forest at a visitor center there, and I didn't have the faintest idea. I'd never done a book signing before. When you're an independent author, you don't have publicist or anybody to help with those things or tell you what to expect or how to be prepared. So no idea how many people were going to show up or if anybody was going to show up. Really didn't know what the heck I was doing. So I had some number of books that I took, 20 or 30 books, I guess, that I had for that signing. And then I had another signing scheduled for like the following weekend. So I had ordered all those books and I was carrying them around the trunk of my car. Then we got there and there was a line when I showed up, and I showed up early, and people came through and basically bought out all the books. And I had to go out to the trunk of the car and pull the books for the next book signing out and bring them. Yeah. And I'm like thinking, if we get 6 or 8 people, I'm going to be pretty excited. And we ended up with like 63 books sold and signed that day. So that was not with one fan, but a bunch of them, as it turned out. And that was, frankly, a pretty great moment.
Yeah. For a first book signing, definitely.
Yeah. And that was kind of probably the point when I really started to realize that that book had hit some of the right notes. And the other fan interaction that I had at a signing, and this has happened to me, I think, twice now. I had somebody come and they said, I bought this book for my dad and I'm going to give it to him for Christmas. And there was another one where they said, I'm going to give it to him for his birthday. And can you sign it to whatever his name was? And, happy birthday or Merry Christmas. And then they give you a little bit of story about why they're buying it for them. To me, that is the ultimate compliment, because it's somebody that you care about, that you love, and that person is going to buy my book and ask me to sign it for them to give to that person who they care that much about. And that's going to be their Christmas present, their birthday present. First time it happened, it really touched me. I was just so honored that somebody would pick this goofy book that I wrote as something that was important enough to give to the person that they love for Christmas present.
Oh, definitely, because they're actually bringing you into their family celebrations.
Yeah, it just touched me that somebody cared enough. And I'm just picturing, somebody coming down and unwrapping it and opening up the book and seeing it there. To me, that's touching, that somebody cared enough to bring your book into their home and to share it with their family.
Oh, definitely. That's amazing. I cannot thank you enough for taking this time to discuss your book with me. You have been just a wonderful guest. It's been so fun talking to you. I love talking to other authors of historical fiction who have those same rabbit hole problems that I have.
I suspect that's probably all of us. I can't say that with certainty, but I feel pretty strongly that that's probably the case. It has been really a pleasure being on and chatting with you here. A couple times as we were talking, I kind of forgot that we were recording this. I just kind of BSing, but yeah, I can't thank you enough for having me on. It was a pleasure.
So there you have it, folks. My interview with Robert Hilliard. And I got so wrapped up in our conversation, I forgot to ask him where you can find him and his books. So be sure to check the description of today's podcast, because you will find links to his website, all the places where you can buy his book, and of course his account on Twitter and Facebook. So be sure to follow him on your favorite social media. And we have got so much coming up in the next few weeks. We have got some incredible authors coming up. Next week we have Ulf Lehmann, who is a German author who writes books in English, and he writes an incredible sci-fi series called the Light in the Dark series. And the week after, for the last part of our April-May episodes, we have Teresa Payton. You will definitely not want to miss this episode. She was the first female CIO, that's Chief Information Officer, for the White House under George W. Bush. She has some incredible information about her book, Manipulated: Inside the Cyber War to Hijack Elections and Distort the Truth. And believe me, this is a very timely topic, and we not only talk about this sort of thing, but we also talk about the cybersecurity issues involving things like TikTok and other social media. So you will not want to miss out. And I do want to add one last thing today before I let you go. I am so sorry about some of the sound issues that we had in this episode today. I tried to clean it up as best as we could. I have no idea why we had these issues, because we're using the same equipment that we use every time, but for some reason it just wanted to be a little glitchy this time. Hopefully it will not happen again. But that's it for today, folks. And now it is time for you all to go forth and be really happy.